מלכה,
כן,
תוכל להתחיל.
בסדר. Good morning to everyone, especially to Rivi. Rivi, I don't see you, but I know you're there. I actually saw you before and I heard you speaking, telling the women that you would stop a little bit early and answer questions, which is a wonderful idea. Welcome to everyone who's there at Matan. I also somehow don't see you, but I heard voices, so I have to, we have Emunah, so I have to believe you're all there and some of you on Zoom. I just wanted to say, as this is the 12th of Cheshvan, yesterday being the 11th was the yahrzeit of Rachel Imenu, and the day after is the yahrzeit of a very dear personal friend and mentor to me, Fania Gottesfeld-Heller. Several years ago, she passed away. I think 4. And it's on this day, so I especially wanted to mention it. And I was actually looking at the course, the Learn and Tour course, this year, From Ruins to Return. And that's in the days of the Tanakh, the end of the Tanakh, the ruins, the destruction of Yerushalayim, Shivat Zion, coming back. And that could actually also, that title, From Ruins to Return, could also be a title of Fania's life, because she, out of the ruins of the Holocaust, literally, for 2-3 years, they were hidden in a hole. And she somehow had the strength, and I think she was the strong force in the family, saving them, her parents as well, her brother, and they were all able to survive. Somehow, mysteriously, her father met his death right at the end of the Holocaust, I think trying to go out and get food for them or meet up with people. It was very traumatic for Fania that after they survived all these years hiding in a hellhole, that somehow her father was killed. And she, out of these ruins, she was able to tell her story when most people in the Holocaust, including my parents, my booby, were not able to talk. She was able to tell her story proudly. Say means proudly, not proud of what was done to the Jewish people, but that there were Jewish people who were resilient and who stood up and who fought and who still had hope even in the darkest hours. She became a noted author and a renowned lecturer all through the United States and in different parts of the world, taking tours to Poland. And the returns coming then out of the Holocaust to the United States, bringing hope to so many communities, Jewish communities, non-Jewish communities, going to the inner city in Harlem in New York and giving that community hope as she had in the Holocaust, that you can survive, you can make it. She learned English, she taught herself English and went to school, took courses in literature, philosophy, art. A very accomplished woman, helped her husband with business, raised 3 children beautifully in Jewish, providing them with Jewish education. And at the young age of 70, Tefania died in her early mid-90s. At the young age of 70, she also came to Matan in the summer program. We made a 3-week special program. I learned with her and had other great scholars learning with her. And she was so proud and so thrilled to be able to really learn in depth Tanakh and Gemara. This was a great thrill, and she became a wonderful partner to us in our work in Matan, dreaming together with me in what we're building here at Matan. And we have such graduates as Shani Tarragon, Rivi, who were Rabbanit Shani Tarragon and Rivi Frankel, who were leading this course, leading so many others in their learning of Tanakh and Talmud and seeing Israel. It's really, Fania is such a wonderful example of ruins to return. And now I will return the microphone to Rivi, and who will continue with her teaching. Thank you, everyone, and a good day and good things to everyone. A wonderful year ahead.
Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about her life. That was really beautiful and the perfect way to really start us off. So before I do that, I want to get the lights on. I want to turn the projector off so that there's not a bright light in my face and a glare on the screen. Where is the perfect? And let's get the air on. Is anybody else a little warm? Okay. Does everybody have a source sheet? Great. Here. Okay, and for those of you who did not hear because you were logging in just in the first few minutes before class started, I recommend bringing a Tanakh to the class. Your source sheets don't have the actual sefer that we're going to be learning, so you can bring a Treyasar, but there are times, especially in this series, that we're going to be switching between different Sfarim and Tanakh to compare kind of the different perspectives to be able to really glean all that we can from the text. So in addition to the dedication that Malki just told us, also all of the shiurim are in memory of Moshe ben Rabbanit Malki and Rav Aaron Bina, who should be all blessed with a long life and a healthy life, who passed away this Hoshana Rabbah. And so we will dedicate our learning in his memory as well. So just to clarify a couple of like introductory pieces. So our Learn and Tour course is structured as follows. I teach first semester, and in first semester, we're going to be looking at Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, which are the last three Svarim, very, very little ones. Zechariah is a little longer, but for example, Chagai that we're starting today is 2 prakim, and they're not long prakim. And then Shani is going to be teaching second semester Ezra and Nehemiah. And then every approximate 3 to 4 weeks, depending on how Hanukkah falls out, etc., with the first tour being on November 1st, we are going to not learn here in Matan together or on Zoom together, but rather Shuli Mishkin is going to be taking us to see this idea of ruins and return, whether that's the archaeological ruins, talking about Nehemiah building a wall, whether it's talking about Yerushalayim itself, or talking about this idea that Malki so eloquently put, that ruins to return is really a theme that we see throughout Jewish history. And I think, like I said, that's a beautiful segue to what it is that we're really going to be delving into in the beginning of our learning together in Chagai, in Sefer Chagai, and then eventually in Zechariah and Malachi. And that is, if we take a look at the first source already, we're going to really just jump right in. Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi are the end of prophecy. We're really talking about the end of a very significant stage, not just for the Jewish people, but for the world at large. Because at the end of Chagai, Zechariah, and I'm going to say Malachi, although I will say, and I know Shani covered this last week, we're not 100% sure when Malachi wrote his nevuah, when Malachi lived. We're not even really sure if his name was Malachi, if that was a title that was given to him. And so we group them because we know that it's connected to Bayit Sheni somehow, and we're told in the Gemara very clearly that Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, if you take a look at the Gemara in Sanhedrin, that Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi are the end of Nevuah. And so this is a real shift for the Jewish people. And we have to wonder, did they know? Could they already sense that prophecy was beginning to wane? Were they transitioning the people in this foundation of the time of Bayit Sheni, in the building of the second Beit HaMikdash? Were they getting the people ready for the idea that prophecy was going to change? And this is a question that we're really going to struggle with in different variations throughout our study of these 3 Svarim. Because if we take a look at the different sources and at the different reactions that the leaders in Bnei Yisrael have to these Nevuot, we have to wonder, did they think that this Beit HaMikdash was going to be forever? Was there already a knowledge that this Beit HaMikdash too would be destroyed? Was it a fear? Was it a worry? Was it a knowing, right? And so we have to understand that piece of this time period as well. And so when we talk about the idea of transitioning, we really have to look at all of Treyasar as a book. And if you take a look at source number 2, this is the very famous, I'm sure that it's been brought for you many, many times, and you've learned it many times before, but I couldn't not bring it in this conversation. And that's the Gemara in Bava Batra, where Chazal are wrestling or discussing or giving us a tzah as to who wrote which book when and why the order of Tanakh was placed in the order that it was. Is it a chronological order? We know that there's a very famous discussion, a very famous argument even, I would call it, between Rishonim about whether Chamishe Chumshik Torah, right? Ein Muchar Mukdam B'Torah. There's no real chronology in the Torah. And yet when we get to Nevi'im and Ketuvim, there seems to be a chronology until something comes out of chronology. And then we have to explain why. And so Chazal in this piece of Gemara really deal with that. And I brought you a very small piece. Now, for those of you not familiar with the way that the English works in these source sheets, any Gemara that I bring, so the translation in bold is the actual translation of the words, or as close to possible, right? We all know that when we read a translation, we're also reading some sort of interpretation. Right, we're reading some sort of, you have to, I teach in a seminary as well, and I was really hitting this point home with them the other day about what you have to give up when you translate, when they're translating. They're like, what do you mean? I'm just reading what it says. But you're reading what you think it says, or you're reading it in a way that makes sense in English, but is that what it really says? And so we know that every single translation we read is some sort of interpretation. Side point, as a tour guide, I can't help but add this, that Ben-Gurion spoke over 14 languages. David Ben-Gurion, our first prime minister. And if you ever go to his house in Tel Aviv, you think that he couldn't possibly have read any more books than the library in his house in Tel Aviv. And then you go down to his house in the Negev in Sde Boker, and there are all these books. Why did he speak 14 languages? Because he didn't want to read the translations of books he wanted to read. So some of the languages being European, and as a Canadian American, the idea of speaking a language and a half, I tell people all the time I'm bilingual, and it's not two lingual, it's good bilingual, right? I came to Israel and I don't speak English or Hebrew anymore. But the idea for Europeans, especially of speaking a few languages, is not strange. But for Ben-Gurion, he had to read every single work that he wanted to read in his own view. He didn't want anybody translating for him. So going back now, side point, going back now to our source, the bolded is a translation, but then because it's the Gemara, so we have these words that are not bolded to kind of tie the rest of it together for us. And so let's take a look. The Gemara answers, since his prophecy is written together with those of Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi in one book of the 12 prophets, and Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi were the last of the prophets, he is counted with them. It's this whole discussion about Hosea and where Hosea belongs and the chronology of Hosea. Right now, why? The Gemara inquires, but let the book of Hosea be written separately and let it precede the others. The Gemara answers, were written separately. Since it's small, it would be lost. So it seems to be telling us, the Gemara and Bava Batra, that the reason that these 12 books are put together is because they might be lost, right? Chagai, we're going to see, we're not going to get through the entire Sefer today, but in theory we could, right? It's not so hard. The first parak is 12 psukim, and then the second parak is also very short. So it's very, very small book. We have some books in Treyasar that are one parak, right? Yonah, we read 5 prakim. But if we were to really be critical about this statement, let's take a look at the rest of Tanakh. Eicha is how many prakim? 5, right? Zechariah is 14. Hosea, Amos are longer than some of the Megillot that we have, Ruth. So how is it that those books can stand on their own, but a book like Hosea or a book like Zechariah needs to be lumped together? So already we have a logic question about this because it seems to contradict. And so we have to wonder if that example or that answer that we're given as to why Treyasar is put together has to be deeper. And what I would like to suggest is that in fact, Treyasar is exactly this story of ruins to redemption. It's exactly this pattern of galut, and we'll see, because at the very, very end of Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, at the end of this course, I hope to be able to put these 3 svarim into the pattern. So I don't want to talk about the pattern yet, because I want to explore the pattern and discover the pattern together through the text, and then we can see if it works with the rest of Treyasar. But the idea that there is this pattern of galut. Now, again, we're talking right now about classical Nevi'im, right? So we have these Nevi'im that we have the Nevi'im Rishonim, right? So we have the Sefer Yoshua and Shmuel and Malachim. Let's take Sefer Malachim, for example, written by Yirmiyahu. There's a very clear historical focus of starting the kingship, really starting with the Davidic dynasty, and how somehow we got to destruction. Right? There's a very clear message there, but it's not the type of nevuah where we have Yirmiyahu, so says K'amar Hashem, Ne'um Hashem, these very proclamations that we are familiar with in Nevi'im Achronim. These are those same types of Nevuah. And why were those Nevuah written down? A different source that we have outside of Baba Batra that people are very familiar with is the Gemara in Megillah that tells us Nevuah she'netzrucha l'dorot, Nevuah that's needed for generations. And that's exactly what Malki was saying and exactly what we're going to discover. And I think what we're going to struggle with a little bit, and I have to preface by saying, I don't have all the answers in terms of how we parlay what we're going to read and what we're going to learn into modern times of redemption. I think it's a very, very interesting question. And some of the sources that I brought, I think really struggle with that. And I'd be very happy and curious to hear what people's opinions are when we get to those sections. But if we're saying that Treyasar is about a pattern that is necessary to take people from Galut to Geula, so then we go back to our original question is, did Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi know that there was going to be another Galut? Were they preparing the people for the eventual demise of the second Beit HaMikdash, of the period of Shivat Zion, of Nevuah? In the same way that we might suggest Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai does it, right? When we have that transition of the actual destruction, where he takes us from a people that are centered around the temple, and all of a sudden we become centered around the community. And yet so much of what we do still harkens to what we did at the temple, at the Beit HaMikdash, because we want to get back there, right? And because we don't want to forget that. The same thing you could argue with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and the redaction of the Mishnah, right? There were these big time periods in history that were transition. And I think that we'll agree as we read through the Psukim that the Nevi'im are preparing the people, and I think us as well, because I can't tell you how many times I myself have thought, how many times I've had conversations with students about the question of, well, if I just knew, like if Hashem just told me, I would totally do it. It's like, first of all, let's look at Yirmiyahu, right? Let's look at all of the different times that the Nevi'im come and tell us, like, there's a reason that we have the phrase in Amos of Parot Bashan, right? There's a reason that we're being called, oh, you fat cows of the Bashan, right? In Treyasar. There's a reason that we have all this Nebuah, because we didn't listen even with Nebuah. So first, let's put that on the table. But second of all, it's true. There's something so comforting. Shmuel can't find his donkeys, or his father's donkeys. And so he goes to look out, Shaul can't find his father's donkeys. And so he goes to look for the Navi to find his donkeys, right? How easy would life be if, oh, I don't know who I'm supposed to marry, right? So let me go ask the Navi. Or should I be making Aliyah? Well, the Navi's telling me that I should, so I know that it's the right time. And so we have to prepare, and we have to live in a world where our literature, our history, our gift from God is written in a paradigm that we can't understand. And so I think Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi are the perfect svarim when it comes to trying to understand how to make decisions between right and wrong and time, even when you don't have that definitive God says. And yet the irony of all of this is, we're going to see in just a minute, Chagai is very clear. God says you should do this, and God says you were wrong. But what's beautiful is that the Parshanim are going to come and say, really, Bnei Israel should have known. And one of the reasons Chagai is so emphatic in his Nevuah is because Bnei Israel should have known that all the signs that they were seeing in nature was Hashem telling them. And the Radak says that beautifully. We'll see that soon. So with that, I would like to jump in to just start with Chagai in Perek Aleph. What I'd like to do today is read through Perek Aleph of Chagai with some of the sources here, with some of the Parshanim, to understand what's going on. And then I'd like to go back to this question that we have of, is this a time of redemption? Is this a second best? Are the people in a lichatchila situation? Are they in a first situation? So we're going to first read the Psukim, and then we'll come back together and explore that question through the Psukim that we've read in other sources as well. Questions until now? Yes.
The Strauss are written as one sefer, or was it a bunch of Svarim that were then combined for convenience?
So I can't answer completely. What I can say is that each sefer was individually, or Chazal seem to imply that each sefer was written individually, and they're from lots of different time periods. So it would make sense that the actual text, however, going back to the idea that it's one book, if I take a look at most of the Sfarim in Trei Asar, the end of one sefer uses almost identical language to the beginning of the next sefer. So was it that they were all just written and there's a lot of similar language because of the style, or because we see very often that different Nevi'im will make reference to other Nevi'im? Or were these individual Sfarim that were written that were then kind of sewn together with a very specific message? So it could be both, but it definitely seems from Chazal that they all had their individual authors in addition to how they were maybe put together. Okay, so let's take a look now. We're in Chagai, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Aleph. B'shnat shtayim l'Daryavesh HaMelech b'chodesh hashishi b'yom echad b'chodesh hayad davar Hashem b'yad Chagai hanavi el Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel pachat Yehuda ve'el Yehoshua ben Yehotzadak Kohen Hagadol lemor. There's a lot to unpack in this very first sentence that we have here in the Sefer. So the first thing that I want to do, I know that Shani did a timeline with you last week, and I'm not going to go over that. I also am going to say that what I'm not going to do is talk about the discrepancies between history and Chazal more than just an overview. So when we see here, B'shnat shtayim l'Daryavesh HaMelech. So first of all, this is a very classic Nevuah formula, right? We see this all throughout different Nevi'im, which year of which king, which kingdom, right? So this is the first time that we have it where it's a king outside of a Jewish king, which is very interesting, right? So again, if we're talking about ideals, if we take a look further in the pasuk, what do we have? Pachat Yehuda. That's some sort of a viceroy of Yehuda, some sort of governor, general of Yehuda, not a king of Yehuda. So we see already in the first pasuk, there are things that are not ideal when we think about returning to Israel. But this idea of Daryavesh, who was Daryavesh? And this is where the Parshanim, Chazal, biblical, everybody has a field day with who Daryavesh is. Is Daryavesh a name? Is Daryavesh a title? Is this Daryavesh who's the son of Achashverosh and Esther? Is this Darius that comes before all of that, right? After Cyrus, there was Darius, before Achashverosh hits the scene. The real question that these people, I think, are grappling with from a religious perspective, does the story of the building of the Beit HaMikdash come before or after the story of Purim? Because if you're going to say that the Beit HaMikdash is built in the time of Daryavesh, so then who's the son of Esther and Achashverosh? So then the people that are living in Shushan, well, maybe they had an opportunity to go to Eretz Yisrael. There was no Beit HaMikdash. So that's one type of approach to Megillat Esther, right? It's the story of the Jews who are living in Galut. But if you want to say that this Daryavesh is a Daryavesh that comes before the story of Purim, that means that they're already being criticized for not building the Beit HaMikdash. And the story of Megillat Esther becomes a story of criticism of Jews in Shushan who have not come back to Eretz Yisrael to help build the Beit HaMikdash. So there are very significant theological ramifications for which Daryavesh this is, how we get to which Daryavesh this is. The other challenge that comes out of here, which is really quite fascinating, you may want to take a source sheet so that you can follow along with us. The other really big piece is that if we look at the number of years that we believe that the Persian kingdom stood historically versus the number of years that it seems through Chazal that the Persian kingdom existed, we have over 150 years that are missing in Jewish history. And this is very famous, you can go online, there are lots of books that have been written about this. In the context of Purim, Yehuda Landi has a really good book that explains with charts and pictures, and it's quite lovely. But interesting, and interesting also, like if you take a look in Perkei Avot, in the first parak of Perkei Avot, so we talk about the Zugot, and then all of a sudden we switch to singular. But when we switch to singular, we still say Kiblu Mehem, right? They got from them. So it seems that even in Perkei Avot, potentially we have missing Zugot, maybe Chazal did it on purpose. Like there are so many theories about these missing years, and that is where I will leave you with your curiosity on the missing years. I'm not making a statement because the truth is, it's a little bit irrelevant for my purposes or our purposes together in this course about when exactly in history in comparison to Daryavesh, before Purim, after Purim, that piece of it for what we're going to do together, we're still talking about Shivat Zion. So the ramifications of people in Galut and Shushan, etc., are less critical to what we're doing. And so if I don't have to make a statement, I don't want to make a statement, and I don't have a statement to make about it. Like, I have no idea. Meaning they're very, very authoritative, smart people who take both opinions. And I make no claims to be able to say this one is right and this one is not. And so we will leave it at that. And if you have more questions or you'd like to follow up with places to read about this very interesting debate of Jewish history, and really fundamentally also how we deal with contradictions in history versus explicit statements from Chazal, I'm happy to furnish you with a couple of really good places to read. So with that being said, B'shnat shtayim l'Daryavesh HaMelech, b'chodesh HaShishi, Bayom Echad L'Chodesh. Let's take a look. If you see the Mahari Kra in source number 3, this is Yosef Kara, not to be confused with Rav Yosef Karo, right? Who the author of the Shulchan Aruch, who lived in Sfat, who was from Spain, Spanish descent. This is Yosef Kara. He lived in 1060. He is from northern France, a very well-known parshan, especially on Navi. And so he tells us, B'shana shniya l'malcho b'chodesh hashishi hu Elul berosh hachodesh. So we're talking about Rosh Chodesh Elul. Now, interesting that he's going to come and very kind of classic, just says one thing and then leaves us to try and figure out why this is important. But the truth is the Abarbanel does this for us at the beginning of Zechariah, explains why it's important that this is Chodesh Elul, because the question that we're struggling with in the text is, why do we need to know when it is? That's not so classic. Meaning, yes, telling me that it's the second year of Daryavesh, that's a pretty standard formula. But telling me that it's the second year and it's Rosh Chodesh Elul, but the actual Nevuah has nothing to do with Rosh Chodesh Elul, that seems strange. That doesn't follow the pattern that we're used to. Yeah.
The year is standard, but the month and the day are not.
Correct. The specific day is not, unless it's connected somehow, is not usually expected. And so that's what the Parshanim are going to deal with. So if we take a look at source number 4, we're not going to read the entire thing together, although I did bring it to you because I think there's some really beautiful, when the Abarbanel is known as a wordy Parshan, he starts off usually listing like 17 questions, and then some of the questions kind of repeat themselves. But in reality, when you sit with it, each nuance of each question and each repetition is very beautiful. So for those of you that want to sit and really delve into the Abarbanel, I brought you the entire section. It's not even the entire piece. The entire piece is pages and pages and pages of his answering to this question. But we're going to read just a couple parts of it. So if you take a look at the very end of the first line, שבבוא העת לבניין הבית, בשנת החודש רצון דריווש לתת רשות לבנות, שהיה זה בשנת 2 למלכותו. Right, so we see that here we have, it's time to build the Beit HaMikdash, and Daryavesh is giving permission for that to happen. Skip now to the third line. זה וזה רוצה לומר, רצון המלך ונבואת חגי מאת השם יתברך. So the Abarbanel is coming to tell us that, first of all, you have to realize the fact that this is in the second year of Daryavesh, and the fact that Chagai is going to come and tell Bnei Yisrael to build the Beit HaMikdash are both the Ratzon of Hashem. You may think it's political. You may think that Daryavesh has all of his political, and the truth is, it is political, right? But lest you think that it's a coincidence, so the Navi wants us to know that they're very, very clearly both Ratzon Hashem. And so why does it tell us this date? How does this date cement for us that it's that they're both Ratzon Hashem? So skip down now 2 more lines. Skip down 1 more line. בחודש השישי, באחד לחודש, שהוא ביום הראשון לחודש אלול, להגיד שהזמן שיראוהו על זה שבאותו יום עלה משה להר, לקבל לוחות שניות אחרי שכבר נשברו הראשונות. ככה, אחרי חורבן ראשון באותו יום המקודש עליהם. Okay, so then he goes on to the next one, right? Oh, sorry, that's right. תחילת מם ימי תשובה, בא לחגי נבואה על בניין בית שני, דומה לעניין הלוחות השניות. So what's the Abarbanel telling us? It is connected to Rosh Chodesh Elul. Here we are questioning, already looking at the first line of this nevuah. It's in the time of Daryavish, we have a pachat, we don't have a melech. How could this be lechatchila? But wait, it's Rosh Chodesh Elul.
I don't understand the question.
Meaning, when the Jews are coming back to Israel now, we don't have a melech. It's the time of Daryavish. Daryavish is giving us permission. Compare that to Shlomo HaMelech when he built the Beit HaMikdash, David HaMelech when he conquered Eretz Yerushalayim. How could you say this is a lechatchila time to build the Beit HaMikdash? Comes the Abarbanel and says,
Can you sharpen it?
sure. One of the questions that we're going to struggle with is the Jews feeling like this Beit HaMikdash is less than. This Beit HaMikdash, the time to build the Beit HaMikdash is not a good time. We don't have a malchut. We're going to see that there were less miracles in the time of the second Beit HaMikdash. Is this really redemption? Maybe this is just Hashem throwing us a bone and Hashem's really just forgotten us. I love that you asked that. I don't know if we'll get to it today, but at the end of the source sheet, I have 3 sources that address this because I felt like we're going to see in just a few minutes. I don't know. It's a lot of pressure now. We're going to see that here we're being told you should have known that you should build the Beit HaMikdash. And then here we are and we're living and should we be building the Beit HaMikdash? Should we not? So it's a really interesting discussion that was already started in a disagreement between the Rambam and the Rashi based on sources in the Gemara that we're going to take a look at together at the very end. So hold on to that whole question of today until the end of the parak.
You have to give us time to tell you the question on your map, or you tell us how it is. I have other questions to add.
Okay, I'm ready. Holding on. So here we see that the Abarbanel is telling us, comes the Navi and tells us, but it's Rosh Chodesh Elul. In the same way that the second Luchot were not lechatchila, but what were necessary and in essence lechatchila, right? Bnei Israel didn't view them as lechatchila because they weren't the first ones. But we needed the first Luchot and the second Luchot, right? We needed the God-given Luchot and we needed the Luchot created, shaped by Moshe. That's part of, if you go back and you learn in Shmot, or even if you learn of Soloveitchik, Adam 1 and Adam 2, right? There's this idea in the moral and ethical history of the Torah that there's the lechatchila and there's the what actually happened, and they're both really lechatchila. We need both of them. And so comes the Abarbanel and says, the fact that it's telling us that it's Rosh Chodesh Elul, the fact that it's telling us that it's the same day that Moshe went up to get Sechet Luchot, is telling us that this too is part of that same pattern that we see in history. This is not Hashem forgetting about us. This is not Hashem still mad at us. This is Hashem plugging into the pattern of ruin, of chait, of leaving and coming apart, and now coming together in a different way that strengthens the first way. And I think it's beautiful that the Abarbanel and really the Mahari Kra already from the beginning pointing it out that it's Elul are bringing in this idea, and the same pasuk where we also see that maybe this is disappointing for Bnei Israel. And there's already a nechama in that, in this pasuk, in this Chodesh Elul. And so if we continue going now, so who are these leaders of Bnei Israel at this point? So we have the leaders. The first one is Zerubbabel. Who is Zerubbabel? The pasuk tells us that he is Ben Shaltiel Pachat Yehuda. If we take a look at source number 5, this is the lineage that we see in Divrei Hayamim, and we see that actually Shaltiel is not his father, but his grandfather. And so all the Parshanim discuss why is it listed that it's his father. Maybe his father was more illustrious, and why would it be listed as his son if it was his grandson? Maybe his father didn't follow in that same kind of leadership. Maybe he was raised by his grandfather. We're not 100% sure. But it's interesting that we're being connected back to Shaltiel, who connects us back to Yechonia, right? Connects us back to Malchut David. So it's true that he's not a king. However, why is he the perfect leader? Because if we're trying to reestablish a Jewish kingdom, the fact that the leader of the Jewish people is Ben David is very significant, right? And I think that we see this too when the Rambam discusses Mashiach, right? Mashiach is going to be Ben David. That's what we're told, right? So the idea that the leader establishing a nation, a Beit HaMikdash, a revival of Jewish people is somebody from the line of David, helps the Jewish people in terms of the mentality. Meaning, could somebody else have been Pachat Yehuda? Yeah, somebody else could have been the leader. It's not that only people from Yehuda, but this idea that we're reestablishing something that connects us back to Malchut David and Tzemach David, Avdecha, and all of those Nevuot of Geulah is very significant for the people. In addition, we also see Yoshua ben Yehotzadak. If you take a look at source number 6, again in Divrei Yamim, just a couple of prakim later, we see that Yehotzadak was also a Kohen and that he went into Galut as well during the Galut of Bavel. Now, interestingly, also we see that Zerubbabel is that Yehotzadak and Ezra are brothers, which is really interesting, right? Because Ezra HaKohen. And so this would be Ezra's nephew. And so we have to remind ourselves, pardon, no, it doesn't say that right here. These are the Parshanim who bring it in and they quote different, I didn't bring for you the actual source, I apologize. The idea that reminding ourselves where we are in history in terms of Ezra, right? So the Jews have already come back to Israel. Ezra's already led Jews back to Israel. There are more than 42,000 Jews living here, and they're living in Yehuda. They start to build the Beit HaMikdash after the Cyrus proclamation, right? And Shani showed you that the Cyrus cylinder, right? And then they have to stop. We're gonna see that they have to stop because of a famine. But if we switched and we were to flip now to Ezra Perek Daled, we would see that they had to stop for political reasons because the Shomronim, the Samaritans, went and told the Cyrus that the Jews were trying to overthrow the empire, etc. So we have to remember when we're talking about these familial connections and who's coming back and who's who, where we are in this line of history. So we're here, and what is going to be the goal of Chagai? What is he trying to accomplish in his nevuah and in his perspective? So remember, Ezra says it's political, right? The Samaritans get in the way, and we have to stop building. Chagai is going to tell us something different altogether. So let's look at Pasuk Bet. Ko amar Hashem tzvakot lemor ha'am hazeh amru lo et bo et bayit Hashem lihibanot. So there are a couple of ways that we can read this, but the first most important, Ko amar Hashem tzvakot lemor. This is a proclamation of nevuah. This is a language that when we see this, generally speaking, and this is going to be very important to understanding this first paragraph of Chagai and breaking it down. Generally speaking, this is a sign that we have a new nevuah, that we have a proclamation that is different from the proclamation that came before or the proclamation that comes afterwards. And so, Ko amar Hashem tzvakot lemor, lo et bo et beit Hashem lihibanot. So we could read it that the time has not come, the time to build the Beit HaMikdash, or we could read it that the Ha'am Hazeh says, the time has not come, pause, it's the time to build, right? So you can either read it, I'm going to say it again, we can either read it that Ha'am Hazeh amru, lo eit bo eit bayit Hashem lihibanot, as one phrase with repetitive language, that the time has not yet come. What time? The time to build the Beit HaMikdash. Or we could read it that Chagai is saying, Ha'am Hazeh amru, right? The Bnei Yisrael said, lo eit bo, the time has not come, pause. Chagai inserts himself, it's the time to build the Beit HaMikdash. And the reason why this reading is important is because if we take a look now at the next pasuk, Vayhi Hashem b'yad Chagai hanavi lemor, it seems, and this is really where the Parshanim are going to start to struggle, that we have a second nevuah here. If you're looking in a sefer that has the different breaks, right? So we see that there's a gap here. We see that there's something else happening. And so many of the Parshanim would like to suggest that this short nevuah of it's time to build the Beit HaMikdash is directed specifically at the leaders of the time. Where are you, leaders? It is time to build the Beit HaMikdash. Bnei Yisrael are saying it's not the time, it's the time. Why are you allowing the people to be driving the leadership as opposed to the leadership driving or partnering or inspiring the people. Let's take a look now at the source. I quoted Rashi before, and I feel like generally speaking, I try and give us dates and where we're talking and the names of people, right? We said the Maharikra of Yosef Kara. We just kind of gloss over Rashi. Like I know we all know who Rashi is, and he's like, it's almost to his credit, but I feel like it's important to say that he lived in 1040, he died in 1103. He lived in France. He also had a vineyard, wrote a parish, obviously, on Torah as well as on the Talmud. So I think that Rav Shlomo Yitzchaki was his name, and that's where Rashi comes from. So just I feel like we need to give Rashi his, at least once in a while, remind ourselves a little bit about his background. So what does he say? So Amazamru, why did the nation say that this is not the time? So skip a little bit into the middle of the first line. So akim et devarai she'amarti lifnei milot l'charvot Yerushalayim ayin shana. So why are the Jewish people saying it? Because they're worried that I'm not going to keep my promise. Exactly what we were saying before. It's Pachat Yehuda, right? We don't have a king. It's Daryavish that's telling us. Hashem, he promised us 70 years. He didn't really mean 70 years. That was at the time to make us feel good. But it's not the time now. They're feeling discouraged. They're feeling like Hashem has forgotten them. Malki mentioned at the beginning when she was dedicating the class to her friend about post-Holocaust. You can imagine and hearing survivors, knowing survivors, maybe even being the children or grandchildren of survivors, that feeling of where was God? God deserted us. God forgot about us. They've just experienced this chorban, not just of the Beit HaMikdash, 70 years ago, right? Yachasit, 70 years ago, we can understand that time frame, what 70 years of a chorban means. We have not gotten over the trauma as third and fourth generation, maybe even fifth generations are being born, of what that did to the Jewish people. And in addition to so many Jews being wiped out, they also lost Eretz Yisrael. They lost their homelands in a time where that hadn't happened before. Meaning by the time we get to the Holocaust, Jews have been kicked out of European countries for centuries. Exactly. That's exactly the best way to put it, right? This was nothing new, traumatic, chaz v'shalom. But the first time to be kicked out of the land that's supposed to be ours forever, even if the Nevi'im told us we had it coming, and 70 years later, they're like, really? This is the time? We're going to come back? We're back. We're living. These are the people that came back, right? These are the 42,000 people that came back with Ezra. But Hashem's going to build. This is not the time. We're still in ruins. And so Rashi is pointing that out to us. He's highlighting the fact that on the one hand, we can criticize, right? And we're going to see that Haggai has a lot of criticism for this generation. But at the same time, perhaps we can relate to the trauma, to the fear, to the uncertainty of, could this really be the time 70 years after destruction? Let's take a look at the Malbim for a second. And he also is going to have a very interesting take. We will get to the Malbim's approach to Haggai and this question of, was it lechatchila? Was it b'diavad? Was this real redemption? Did they think the second Beit HaMikdash was going to last forever? It was a really big machloket until really the time of the Malbim. The Malbim really brought a very specific approach to it, a consolation approach of the two different sides, and we'll get to that. In the meantime, you'll see that the two parshanim that I really leaned on in preparing these classes were the Malbim and the following sources of Rav Hirsch. So the Malbim lived in Ukraine. I actually wrote down the dates because I don't always remember them. 1809 to 1879. Meir Leibish ben Yechiel Michal. That's where the name Malbim comes from. Meir Leibish Yechiel Michal. So it's an acronym of his name, the son of his father's name. Relatively recent, right? 1800s. And he and Rav Hirsch, I think, are particularly interesting. So, for example, we mentioned already Sefer Melachim. Some of you, I think, have learned Sefer Melachim with me, at least the beginning of it. When we talk about Sefer Melachim, so I leaned very heavily on the Abarbanel. Why? Because the Abarbanel understood what it meant to live in a king's court, right? The Abarbanel, I know did we do the Abarbanel yet? We did the Abarbanel. The Abarbanel lived in Portugal, right? He lived in Portugal in a time where he was a finance minister in a royal palace. And so for him to talk about royalty really gives us an insight that goes beyond just his spiritual insight to the text, which is very important from all the Parshanim, and his critical insight to the text, but his history is very important in that. The Malbim, and I would even say more Rav Hirsch, as a modern posek, or rather, Rav Hirsch really was a posek, but as a modern commentator, trying to find the messages of Chagai and how they speak to modern people, I think is very relevant for what we're attempting to do in this course. And especially when we get to Rav Hirsch. So Rav Hirsch was not just a commentator and a local rabbi, he was really a leader of leaders. And he founded a movement. And so the idea of somebody like that using Chagai to understand what our response to Chagai's Nevuah is, I think will be very helpful as modern people, especially living in the land of Israel. I have to tell you that when I spent, for the first time since I made Aliyah, I came to Israel in 2006, I got to go back to America for 6 weeks. I've been back to America a week here, a week there, but I'm a tour guide. So during the summers, I have groups, I have families, and there were no tourists. I had one group in the past year and a half that's been able to make it in August, a Hasidic girl's birthright. Oh, ask me questions about that one later. Let me tell you, it was really interesting. So I got to spend 6 weeks with my family, which I haven't done, like I said, since I made Aliyah. And it was such a highlight of the past few years, especially with COVID and not being able to see them for 2.5 years to go. And there's no pressure, right? So I have a 17-year-old brother. And if he doesn't want to hang out with me for more than half an hour one day, that's okay, because I'm here tomorrow. As opposed to when you go for a week, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, when you go to America or wherever you're from for a week, it's like, no, you have to spend all this time because I'm leaving. So it was beautiful. And I also took the time to really review a lot of these sources. And I said to myself, and I said this to my dad as well, I am so lucky that I am not teaching this in America, because I think that the messages here are so clear about coming back to Eretz Yisrael and so clear about responding to Chagai and Zechariah's messages. Now, Chagai, as we're going to keep seeing, he's talking very specifically now, right? It is time to build the Beit HaMikdash. We're going to see Zechariah as well as Malachi also talk about the future. So it's a little bit easier to read. It's time to build the Beit HaMikdash. Okay. In that year, the second year of Daryavesh, it was time to build the Beit HaMikdash. He's not talking to me. But what the Malbim does in source number 8, and what we're going to see also Rav Hirsch does in source number 9, is they make it hit home. This is Nevuah Shentzorcha L'Dorot. This is Nevuah that was needed to be heard by generations. And they really bring it home for us in a very hard-hitting way. So let's take a look at source number 8. The Malbim, Ha'amazeh Amru Lo 8. שהיה מקובל ביד האומה בפני נביאים שלפני גאולה האמיתית צריך שיהיו מופתים בשמיים ובארץ שיהיה מלחמת גוג ומגוג. So the Jewish people are sitting there and they're saying, listen, there's supposed to be signs and wonders. It's supposed to be this miraculous time. And there's supposed to be Gog uMagog. So obviously, this can't be the time of Mashiach. How many times have you been at a Shabbos meal or reading a book or thinking to yourself, was the Holocaust Gog uMagog? Was Milchemet Atzmaut Gog uMagog? The miracles of 1967, of 1973, of the fact that we have Eretz Yisrael, is that what we mean by signs and wonders? We do this today, right? We today, to this very day, try and base our understanding on, is this the time of Mashiach? We see the signs. They were doing the exact same thing, says the Malbim. What does it mean it's not time? There's no flashing lights that say Zman Mashiach Hine Ba, right? There's no picture of the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rabbi Nachman and Meron, right? The idea, pardon?
They did not put ways.
They did not put, exactly, they didn't have ways. There was nothing saying to them that this is the time of Mashiach. Skip down now to the 1, 2, 3, 4th line from the bottom, the middle of the source, the sentence. And how could you say that this is time for the building when everything that's supposed to happen before the building hasn't happened yet? I will very tangentially come back to your question about building the Beit HaMikdash. According to the Rambam, who's supposed to build the Beit HaMikdash? Well, according to the Rambam, we are led by Mashiach, right? As opposed to Rashi, who says Hashem builds it. So yeah, if there's no Mashiach to build the Beit HaMikdash, or the person who builds the Beit HaMikdash, we could call him Mashiach, either way that you want to look at it.
I thought it's supposed to come down complete.
Because you're a Rashi fan. There you go. Okay, and that's the machloka that we're going to get to at the end of this section. But it can't be the time to build the Beit HaMikdash because no Mashiach has stood up and said it's time to build the Beit HaMikdash. So now, if we understand that this is a nevuah specifically from Chagai to the leaders, be the Mashiach, be the leader. Reassure the people, stand up and say, this is the time. This is not a fault of the people. The people are in trauma. The people are waiting for you to stand up and say, we are building the Beit HaMikdash. And you're just sitting here. And so we understand from this perspective of the Malbim how this would be a very poignant and specifically focused nevuah only for the leaders.
No leadership. That's what we have today.
Nachon, very clearly. It's really very interesting. I will try and remember to bring in the tshuva next week if I can remember, just for whoever's interested. We won't really go through it, but when they were founding the state in 1947, 1948, what was the government, the form of government going to be here in Israel? And they questioned if we should have a king. I don't know if that would be better, to be quite honest, right? What kind of king? Would it be similar to the King of England? Would it be, or the Queen of England right now? Would it be some sort of, pardon?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so they looked at, well, here we have, right, in the very, very clearly in Sefer Shmuel, it's not good that we don't have a king. If you read the messages very, I think they're explicit, but the truth is they really are implicit. But I think they're very bolit. They're very clear in Shoftim. This is what happens when you don't have a king. Then if you're in charge of setting up the new country of Israel, what were we going to call it, by the way? Were we going to call it Israel? Were we going to call it Yehuda? Like, what was all of these decisions that have to be made, right? Part of me was like, I kind of wish I was there and like involved. And the other part of me was like, I want to stay really far away. So I kind of like, I'll be a fly on the wall. That's that would be my dream, I guess, to hear how these conversations went. But as a religious leader to say, well, maybe we should look at having a king. And then is that king going to be somebody who's appointed because of merit? Is that king going to be somebody that's appointed because of lineage? All of these questions exist. But so in terms of leadership, we don't have a king yet. We do have somebody who's from Pachat Yehuda. He does have a partner. There is some sort of partnership going on between the Kehuna and the Malchut, which is the checks and balances that were by definition built into the system, right? You can never be in this. If we want to say what the problem at the time of the Maccabees was, right? If we want to say the problem at the time of Hanukkah, the Kohen Gadol were also the king. By definition, somebody can't be from Yehuda and also be a Kohen. We have it built into the system that there are different branches of power. America got some things right? They're biblical foundings. So this idea that the leadership needs to stand up and that there is no leadership, and today there's no leadership, is really a problem that needs to be thought about when rebuilding. And we're going to see Zerubbabel and his partner Yotzedek were great. They were great partners. They did a good job. They messed up here, but they have no model of leadership, right? They didn't grow up in the palace. They didn't grow up in the Beit HaMikdash. They grew up in Bavel. So their response to Chagai, I think, is beautiful. Let's take a look now at source number 9, what Rav Hirsch says. Rav Hirsch lived in 1808 until 1882, so he was actually born a year before the Malbim was born. He lived in Germany. The Malbim lived in Ukraine. So obviously very different, like you have Ukraine type of personality and a yucky kind of personality, right? He dies in 1882, which is actually a couple years after the Malbim, but in all intents and purposes, they were contemporaries. And he says the following: the prophet reproaches the people for their indifference and inertia, which they hid under the pretext that the conditions of the time were not propitious. Full of irony, he hurls their own words back at them, the words which they had hitherto evaded the demand to proceed with rebuilding the temple. Et Bayit Hashem lihibanot means the favorable time for the house of God to be built. Now they say, according to Haggai, that not only has the time not yet arrived, but the time is not here altogether. In other words, the whole prevailing conditions are such that could not even approach the right time for the building of the temple. Not only was it not the right time before, but even now, Haggai, as you're standing here, it's still not the right time. I have that fear. I will tell you, I'm going to make an admission. I grew up Lubavitch, and most of my Lubavitch education in terms of community came from camp. And so like Tisha B'Av and how we did Tisha B'Av in camp and all of these different ideas. And the idea growing up, especially after the Rebbe's Levaya and all of that kind of stuff, that we were talking about in my non-Lubavitch classes about who's Mashiach and what's Mashiach and that lack of certainty, I was always scared that Mashiach's going to come and we're going to miss it. Right? And there are all these jokes that people tell now. All of these ideas that like, oh, Mashiach's going to be Sephardi and the Ashkenazim are going to say, oh, you can't be Mashiach, right? Or like all of these like kinds of like, why does the shul have why does a community have 3 shuls? Because it's the Sephardi shul, the Ashkenazim, the one I don't go to, right? Like all of these different, that Mashiach come and we wouldn't even recognize it. And that's literally what happened to Haggai. And the first time I read that, I was like, I felt very validated in the idea that we really could miss something. And now, obviously, what you do with that fear as a child and how that manifests is very different than maybe what Rav Hirsch is telling us, right, on an intellectual, logical, adult, mature way of thinking. But they missed it. And it's an interesting, if we're looking at it from a modern lens, what that means. And again, going back to how could you teach this in America? Like, how could I be preparing this in America? Like, how do you say that? Like, the time is to make aliyah. The signs are really clear. You're all missing it, right? Like, I can't say that. And I apologize for any of you that are watching the recording, and you're all wonderful people. And I'm the only one in my family that lives here. I'm the first person in 2,000 years, as far as we know, in my family to come back to Israel. My grandparents hadn't been here. My parents hadn't been here until I came. My great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents. This is not a judgment on people not making aliyah. But when you read this, it seems so clear to me that it's possible to miss it. And what that fear would do to a person, or what that fear should do to a person, or why this is needed for generations. So let's keep going. For building the temple, that time seems to be suspended indefinitely, right? It's never going to be the time. So we all know people like this, putting it back in the context of aliyah for a second, like, oh, well, my kids, I want to wait to find my husband or my wife. And then I need to finish paying off my med school loans. And now my kids are too old. Now I have grandkids, like I don't know how to deal with the medical system, right? There's never a good time to do something. Exactly. Or every excuse is good enough, right? That's really how it is that there's always, it's suspended indefinitely. And the truth is, we know this is not just the case with Aliyah, right? Like people going on a diet. Well, I can't go on because it's just the Chagim. And now it's after the Chagim, but like Hanukkah's coming up and they've already put all the donuts in, right? And like, if I'm living in America, so then it's the pumpkin spice and I have to go to Starbucks and get my pumpkin spice. So like everything is suspended indefinitely if you want it to be. All excuses of the people that the time is not ripe will not justify their lack of action, so says the prophet. With God's help, an earnest will would likely overcome even the apparently most unfavorable prevailing conditions. Hashem will help you if you start, says Rav Hirsch. Yeah.
In a weird way, I understand their hesitation because, when the Jewish people came to the prophet Shmuel, they're like, we want a king. And it wasn't the right time. They got Shaul, and then he was good at the beginning, but it wasn't actually came from the right tribe. So maybe the Jews needed a more clear sign.
Beautiful. So I think that would be the take more of Rashi, right? Rashi and even the Malbim are saying this is to the leaders. This isn't about the people. The people are justified. The people are scared. The people are traumatized. You need to show them that it's okay, right? You need to be Shmuel Hanavi, who isn't upset with them for asking for a king, right? You need to be David HaMelech, even Shaul at the beginning, right? You need to be the leader that shows them that this is the time and it's okay. Rav Hirsch, while he actually doesn't mention what his take is on how many nevuot there are, as far as I remember, but Rav Hirsch is talking to the people about how to read this, meaning it's true. We can totally understand it. But if I'm sitting here and I'm saying, oh, so this is just going to justify my fears, Rav Hirsch is saying, no. We can't let this, as modern readers of the prophet of Haggai, we have to say, even if we're afraid, there's always something to be afraid of. that make sense?
There is something happening in our time that I don't think it was at any other time. Something happened anywhere within 2 minutes, the whole world.
Yep.
And this is a sign of Mashiach. Because Muhammad said, I'm Mashiach, and the whole world will know it. That's it.
So I definitely think that there are all sorts of ways to read modernity. For example, we talk about the perfection of the human body. If you look at the Ramchal at Olam Habayis, he talks about the human body 2.0. The fact that eventually we're not going to need transplants because we're going to be able to like regenerate and stem cells and all of that, like those can all be read. And I think people read what they want to read into things. And I think it's beautiful when when a person is able to live on a plane of like, this is pointing us towards the end. I think that's a beautiful plane to live on. I also think that sometimes people live in a less messianic rationalist approach, which is this could be the time of Mashiach and there are all these things set up, and it could not be. And we'll talk about that approach as well. But I think that it's very easy to look at a lot of modern technology and to look at the way that the world is and say, yalla, this is it, we're here. And I think that that's a very correct way. And I really applaud people who are able to live in that kind of view.
I think one of the biggest promises is this time we're not going to be kicked out. If Israel established this is the last, we're not going to be kicked out.
So
if this is the truth of the matter.
So I would question, and also very, very on a surface level, because we will get to this. I just finished reading the English version of Rav Amital's biography, Yehuda Amital of Gush Etzion. Fascinating read for anybody that's interested. The Hebrew one is, they're pretty similar. Like sometimes I like to read the Hebrew and the English to see how they're different, which one to recommend, things like that. I think they did a very good job with the translation. I would be interested in hearing your reaction to his process or the analysis of his process by his students in that question. I don't know that we can say definitively that we're here for good. I would love to be able to say that. And I think, so again, when you have Shivat Zion and you have a second Beit HaMikdash,
Animals, we have richness on our table. That was never in the history of Israel.
so I would love, and again, I don't want to get into this now because we will talk about this later. No, and I'm happy to have the discussion. I'm not shying away from the discussion. I want to have the discussion in the context of the story and the context of the sources. But I would challenge you to find me a source that is not a modern Kabbalistic source or a modern Rav Kook source that would point to the fact that we could not lose Eretz Yisrael as we have it today. Because I'm not familiar with one. And so I would love, again, so I challenge you to bring me that and for us to discuss that, because my understanding of the
sources are in our stuff.
Okay, so I like to be grounded in these kinds of discussions. And again, we will come back to this and we can continue this because I think it's very relevant. I think that's the question is, did they think that the second Beit HaMikdash would last forever? Do we think that Eretz Yisrael, hopefully not the way that we have it, because we all know that things that need to be fixed, but the idea that this is kibbutz galiot and that again, like I'm the first person in my family in 2,000 years to live in Israel. Like, I don't want to, like, I made the decision to live here so that my children could live here and my grandchildren could live here. Ad yemot, who knows, right? Like the idea that we would lose it, I can't even, I don't want to believe it's possible, but I think that the idea of holding on to it in a way that there's no fear that we could lose it is also dangerous.
Yes. Syria, it's coming from South Egypt. Just put one rocket on there.
And I don't mean from the side of Tefillah, but hold on, let's continue now with Rav Hirsch, and we will come back to this because I do want to end with Rav Hirsch, and it's an interesting discussion, but I do want it to have it grounded in the sources that we're learning. And please bring me a source and let's continue the conversation. Okay, with these words, this is the last paragraph that we're reading on refresh over here. Okay, with these words, the prophet has said everything that needed to be said, says Zerubbabel, the leader. But in order to clearly stress the futility of bemoaning the prevailing conditions, he adds the admonition, couched in the form of a question. And so this is from Pasuk Daled, which we have not yet gotten to. But as for you, is it then a time for you to dwell comfortably in your homes while this house lies in ruins? Do you then also hesitate when it concerns your personal interests, hesitate from carrying out what is necessary and important? Do you first meticulously examine and consider whether the time is right? Meaning, yes, plenty of people debate whether or not it's time to take out a mortgage, but in the same way that they debate whether or not it's time to take out a mortgage here or there, right? Like, meaning anything that you want to do, eventually you could do, is what Refresh is saying. Were you so prudent in your own affairs? Were you so circumspect when you built your own houses? When it comes to your own personal lives, then every time is the right time. And if there are difficulties along the way, well, they must be overcome. But when it is a question of God's affairs, then real or imagined difficulties serve as sufficient pretext for an action. This contrast is sharply emphasized by the words atem added to lachem, which we will see in Parak Daled. So in Pasuk Daled, what Rav Hirsch is coming to do is to not allow us to justify whether or not that fear is justified. Because sometimes you need to take a leap whether or not you're afraid. And the idea that you're holding back when it comes to God's missions, but when it comes to yourself, and we're going to see the people planted and they worked really hard and they were getting nothing. And so they planted harder and they worked even harder and they still got nothing. Comes Chagai, and he's basically saying, if you would put that effort into the Beit HaMikdash, where would we be? And comes Rav Hirsch as a modern commentator, looking at a modern world of people who are professional, right? Who did Rav Hirsch serve? Who was his community? These were professionals and intellectuals. And he's saying to them, in whatever area it is about God, you always have an excuse. What are you going to do about that excuse? And Kal v'chomer, if you can get over it for your own stuff, the Navi is telling us we can get over it for ourselves. With that, we're going to end for today. I am going to go on to Zoom if I can find the mouse. Oh no, there it is. Okay. Hold on. I see that there are some questions in the chat. I don't think so, but that's just my, I'm not sure. I'm going to look that up. It's a great question. Okay, so I am here now looking. So these are just the source sheets. Are there any questions on the Zoom that we can include in our conversation today? Okay. This is, by the way, this was my experience, or anybody wants to know what it's like to teach on Zoom, especially, this was my experience. All of that, it is so lovely to see the tops of your faces, and I can tell the smiles and the laughs, and thank you for coming. Thank you for being in person. This has really made my morning to be able to teach and learn Torah with people and not boxes. Nothing against you Zoom people. I love you too, and I'm so excited to continue to learn with you. But wow, what a pleasure, what a sweat to be able to learn Torah again in person. So thank you very much, and I will then see you next week. Does class start at 9 or 8? 9. Yeah, hold on one second. Let me just.